A U.S. Navy patrol aircraft was reportedly spotted as the Chinese Coast Guard ship deliberately rammed into a Philippine Coast Guard vessel in the lagoon of Escoda within Philippines' exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea on Saturday. With China reacting that the U.S. plane serves as encouragement for the Philippines to conduct bolder and riskier provocations. A Beijing-based military expert said that the U.S. military aircraft could gather intelligence and potentially carry out jamming on Chinese vessels. The P-8A's presence threatened Chinese Coast Guard, saying it serves as an encouragement to the Philippines to conduct routine maritime patrol in its EEZ.
Between Filipino and BRP Coast Guard vessels to include any traffic on this net and any unsafe or unprofessional actions. U.S. Navy aircraft out.
Noting that U.S. aircraft could also serve as an aerial military journalist contributing to expose China aggressive action at sea. Manila is rejecting Beijing's request to immediately withdraw its Coast Guard ship from hotly contested Escoda Shoal, the new focal point of tension in the South China Sea. The presence of a U.S. Navy patrol aircraft on Saturday deters China's initial plan to disable the Philippines' flagship vessel, BRP Teresa Magbanua, and tow away from the shoal on which China wants to take full control. However, China's plan was failed. Despite countless harassment and the latest deliberate ramming into the sole Philippine vessel, Manila resolved that it would keep its Coast Guard flagship at Escoda, and reiterated its call for restraint from China on the water and in the air in the South China Sea. The Philippines will not succumb to acts of harassment and aggressive behavior, a statement from the National Maritime Council. Initially, Chinese Coast Guard CCG vessel 5205 on Saturday repeatedly rammed 3 times into BRP Teresa Magbanua, one of the biggest ships of the Philippine Coast Guard deployed to Escoda Shoal in April, which is about 75 nautical miles from Palawan. This is Beijing's violent response after Manila's unopposed and successful resupply mission to BRP Teresa Magbanua through air. On August 28, the Philippines sent an H-145 helicopter and conducted airdropping of supplies to the Philippine Coast Guard ship MRRV 9701 station in the disputed lagoon in Escoda. The possibility that China is trying to push the BRP Teresa Magbanua out of Escoda Shoal cannot be discounted, a security analyst said, as Chinese vessels continue to swarm the Philippine Coast Guard ship that has been damaged by ramming. As of Sunday morning, the Philippines' lone vessel in the area was still surrounded by a number of Chinese maritime militia ships, said Ray Powell, director of Maritime Transparency Initiative Sealight. The Philippine ship remains anchored off Escoda Shoal despite sustaining damage from being rammed multiple times by China Coast Guard vessel with bow number 5205. Photo released by the Philippine Coast Guard showed that at least 2 Chinese Coast Guard vessels and 2 People's Liberation Army Navy tugboats were also spotted near the BRP Teresa Magbanua, aside from several militia vessels, raising the possibility that China attempts to tow the Philippine ship away. According to Ray Powell, a former United States Air Force officer, this is the first documented sighting of these vessels at Sabina Shoal to his knowledge, and it's hard to imagine what their purpose of the tugboats. The idea that they may have been sent there is to push the BRP Teresa Magbanua out of the shoal cannot be discounted. Powell said China's large Coast Guard vessels could disable the Philippines' 97-meter multi-role response ship, while the tugs could then push or tow the ship out of the shoal. The Magbanua was sent to Escoda Shoal in response to reports that China may be attempting reclamation work in the area as well as massive coral damage in the area. A think tank warned of the risks of uncertainties and accidents more serious than ship collisions amid increasing Chinese air provocations on Philippines' islands and reefs in the West Philippine Sea. Aerial encounters, especially confrontational ones, face much higher risks and uncertainties compared with maritime encounters. If the Philippines continues its aerial surveillance and monitoring, while China will be compelled to take irresponsible measures, and in the event of an aerial collision, the consequences would be far more severe than those of a ship collision. The Chinese and Philippine Coast Guards have engaged in repeated standoffs over Sabina Shoal since April, when the Philippines sent the BRP Teresa Magbanua, MRRV 9701, to the shoal. It has been anchored at the contested Spratly Atoll ever since. The 97-meter multi-role response ship, which was only commissioned 2 years ago, is the largest and most modern vessel of the Philippine Coast Guard. The Chinese Coast Guard, meanwhile, sent its own response vessels, including the world's largest Coast Guard ship, the 12,000-ton CCG 5901, to monitor the situation. Escoda Shoal, called Shanbin Reef by China and Escoda Shoal by the Philippines, forms part of the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. It is located within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone but is also claimed by China. Over the past week, several incidents at sea have been reported as the Philippines tried to send supplies to the BRP Teresa Magbanua but was blocked by the Chinese side. The Philippines expressed its serious concern over the latest ramming incident in Escoda Shoal. This was after China Coast Guard, CCG, vessel 5205 on Saturday repeatedly rammed into BRP Teresa Magbanua, the biggest ship of the Philippine Coast Guard deployed in April to Escoda Shoal, which is about 75 nautical miles from Palawan. Despite the incident, Manila resolved that it would keep its Coast Guard flagship at Escoda, and reiterated its call for restraint from China on the water and in the air in the South China Sea. The Philippines will not succumb to acts of harassment and aggressive behavior, a statement from the National Maritime Council. Chinese forces surrounded and rammed the flagship of the Philippine Coast Guard Saturday at Escoda Shoal, in the 7th scuffle this month, between Beijing and Manila in the South China Sea. BRP Teresa Magbanua, MRRV 9701, the Philippine Coast Guard's flagship and largest patrol ship, was rammed 3 times by China Coast Guard vessel 5205 around noon. The collisions punched a hole in the Teresa Magbanua's hull and caused other damage. Multiple Chinese vessels surrounded the 97-meter-long Japanese-made patrol ship during the fracas, including 2 Type 837 tugs boats from the People's Liberation Army Navy. Contrary to the Philippines' media release, Chinese state media claims that the Philippine Coast Guard caused the incident. A video released by the China Coast Guard claimed that the Philippines deliberately rammed their vessel, despite the footage showing the collision occurring on Teresa Magbanua's stern. China has its own version of the incident, and criticizing the Philippines for endangering ships and violating humanitarian principles after Philippine vessel deliberately collides with CCG ship at Shanbin Jiao. At 8:02 on Saturday, the Philippine ship 9701 weighed anchor and continued its provocations at China's Shanbin Jiao, also known as Shanbin Reef, in the South China Sea. In response, the Chinese Coast Guard ship 5205 lawfully issued verbal warnings and conducted monitoring and control measures, according to the China Coast Guard, CCG, on Saturday. At 12:06, the Philippine ship deliberately rammed into the Chinese ship 5205 in an unprofessional and dangerous manner, causing a collision for which the Philippines bears full responsibility, CCG spokesperson Liu Dejun said. Exposing the truth behind the August 31st incident, China's aggression against a single Philippine vessel. China's claim that the lone Philippine vessel intentionally rammed their ship is entirely unfounded. Video evidence clearly shows multiple Chinese vessels aggressively swarming the BRP Teresa Magbanua, with CCG 5205 deliberately ramming the Philippine ship, causing significant damage. This act of aggression further underscores China's unlawful presence in the area, already invalidated by the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling that dismissed their expansive claims in the South China Sea. Despite China's accusations of provocation, it is evident that the vastly outnumbered Philippine ship was the target of coordinated harassment by Chinese forces. It is imperative to stand united in defending our sovereignty, sharing the truth, and holding China accountable for its illegal actions. The flagship of the Philippine Coast Guard has been locked in a standoff with vessels from the China Coast Guard, People's Liberation Army Navy and China Maritime Militia since arriving at Escoda in April. Manila sent the Coast Guard's flagship following concerns of a Chinese land reclamation attempt at the maritime feature similar to those seen at Mischief and Subi reefs, which are now full-fledged military bases. Images of the incident from the Philippine Coast Guard show the tugs positioned to the port and starboard sides of Teresa Magbanua. In prior incidents, including one on June 17, Chinese forces have towed and pushed away Philippine vessels from disputed areas. Philippine Coast Guard spokesman J. Terriella said, "Food supplies and provisions for the more than 10 crewmen aboard the ship were at critical level." He accused the Chinese side of using a water cannon against a Philippine Fisheries Bureau vessel. In total, 40 Chinese ships were deployed last week to prevent 2 Philippine Coast Guard vessels from getting close to the shoal, Terriella added. The latest run-in over Escoda Shoal came as U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Chief Admiral Samuel Paparo met General Romeo Bronner, Jr., Chief of the Philippine Armed Forces, in the Philippine city of Baguio to discuss security challenges and military plans at an annual meeting, according to an Associated Press report. When asked about recent Chinese activities in the disputed waters, Paparo on Thursday said, American forces were ready with a range of options to deal with increasing acts of aggression in the South China Sea. If ordered to carry them out jointly, and after consultations with the Philippines, a U.S. treaty ally. A proposal for U.S. ships to escort the Philippines in its resupply missions in the disputed South China Sea in line with the bilateral mutual defense treaty has sparked concerns that such a move could risk dangerous escalations with Beijing. Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, told reporters that the escort of one vessel to the other is an entirely reasonable option within U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, MDT, depending on consultations between both countries.
To the other is an entirely reasonable option within our mutual defense treaty among this close alliance between the two of us.
Joint Philippine-U.S. resupply missions would enhance the chances of success for such operations while strengthening their alliance against the backdrop of the U.S.-China rivalry and Washington's rising interest in the South China Sea dispute. But such joint missions could risk serious escalations in the waterways, and the Philippines might lack the capacity to manage a fallout. The United States could come to aid the Philippines, a key Pacific ally, as China targets its ships in the contested waters in the West Philippine Sea. The U.S. military is open to consultations about escorting Philippine ships in the disputed South China Sea, the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command said Tuesday, amid a spike in hostilities between Beijing and Manila in the disputed waters. Chinese Coast Guard, Navy and suspected militia ships regularly clash with Philippine vessels during attempts to resupply Filipino sailors stationed in parts of the South China Sea claimed by both countries. Should an incident between a U.S. ship and a Chinese ship occur, experts doubt that Manila will have the capacity to stop the two superpower potentially dangerous escalations in its exclusive economic zone. Despite a series of increasingly tense clashes with Beijing in the South China Sea, analysts say the Philippines should resist the urge to invoke its Mutual Defense Treaty, MDT, with the United States and instead focus on diplomatic and strategic collaborations. As tensions continue to rise between Beijing and Manila, particularly with the recent flashpoint at Escoda Shoal, observers note that China's gray zone tactics, such as launching flares at Philippine aircraft, serve as alternative methods to test Manila's resolve and ability to defend its maritime rights. Expert described China's strategy against the Philippines as cabbage tactics, or militarily overwhelming an adversary, and predicted that Escoda Shoal would become Scarborough 2.0 version, in reference to another disputed shoal. However, expert commended the Philippine Coast Guard for proactively positioning the BRP Teresa Magbanua to counteract Chinese pressure, and ensuring it has enough vessels to monitor the area. The Philippine Coast Guard stands firm in its responsibility to ensure the safety and security of their maritime domain while addressing any threats to their national interests.